The main problem here is in seeing a motivation as if it was something that comes from the will. If you understand motivation as if it's something that you do, as something that you choose, then you will never be able to harness any kind of motivation at all. But once you understand it as a natural process that has or operates according to certain causal laws, then you can begin to see how you could influence or bring about certain the conditions that are required for motivation to arise. And of course, the main source of this natural arousal of motivation is memory and desire. So the Ittipada seem to be concerned with this kind of psychological teaching. What is it that gives rise to motivation and also that sustains motivation? In natural settings, of course, living creatures, including human, is naturally motivated by certain hierarchy of needs or desires, just like animals. These are the things which elicit motivation naturally, involuntarily. But in our human case, as you mentioned, we have all sorts of unnatural goals, ends that we are seeking, like learning a musical instrument or writing a thesis or a PhD and so on. And these are things which nature doesn't understand. And so motivation does not arise involuntarily or naturally in the pursuit of unnatural ends like these. Then we have a conundrum here that cognitively or conceptually we want to attain something, but the reserves of motivation that exist naturally in us are not stimulated involuntarily. We have to do something to stimulate them. Now, I wrote about this a lot in Motivation and Effort, in my book, describing these natural functions of the mind which allow for such motivation to happen or to be suppressed in case of unnatural ends. The main thing, of course, is not really whether you want to write a PhD or not, or whether the subject or the PhD is interesting to you or not. The main thing is, for example, even if you apply yourself to Dhamma practice, which is what you would want, you will still find that motivation is not always readily at hand. And you might find that the task of making progress in Dhamma equally difficult as that of writing a PhD, which is something for which you have no desire, or no genuine desire. What matters in the stimulation of motivation is memory. That memory is the most important thing. The more you remember what is it that you must do, what is the task to which you have to apply yourself to, the more motivation aligns itself naturally to that goal. Even if it's still not so readily present, or you could never summon your motivation at will. Nobody could do this. And if this was possible, then everybody would be an arahant, or would be whatever they want to be, without any challenges or obstacles. But because motivation cannot be summoned like this, you have to find a back door, you have to entice it to be stimulated, to be aroused. And this takes time, and you will experience a lot of failure, as all of us do, regardless of whether the goal is something that you genuinely desire or not. So dwelling mentally, remembering and dwelling on the object or the aim or the purpose that you're pursuing helps stimulate motivation in relation to it more frequently. And so the recurrence of memory, of aligning memory with the pursuit, with the aim, increases the frequency of the arousal of motivation. As for the intensity of motivation, now this is something that nearly has absolutely nothing to do with the nature of the goal. The intensity of motivation is something that arises according to its own terms. And this explains why Japanese people, for example, or it reminds me of the time when I was studying music, I was learning the piano, why we have to remain in a situation where we'll be constantly in contact with our goal. For example, if you're learning a musical instrument, you're always near that instrument, so that when you feel the intensity of motivation to practice, you immediately make use of this motivation in the moment of it. Or, as I was mentioning, Japanese people spend long hours in office, for example. It's because of this, it's because they have such culture where they don't apply themselves to their tasks or duties at work unless they have the sufficient motivation, the sufficient intensity of it. And so they could spend half a day at work just trying to get into the work mood, but they're not really doing it, and they know that. But then, suddenly, and out of nowhere, motivation eventually comes. And if this happens on a daily basis. I remember this very clearly when I used to spend hours in a certain room where I had the piano in the conservatoire. Hours and hours. I'm just sitting there reading, drinking coffee, whatever it is. I'm not in the mood for practicing, exercising. But every single day, that mood eventually came. This stimulation or arousal of motivation eventually came. And then I would apply myself completely to a very high level of concentration and high level of quality of attention. I would apply that to my practice. And so you couldn't, this is very important to understand, that you couldn't bring about that kind of motivation willfully. Nobody could. This is not how motivation works in terms of the mind, psychology, mentally speaking. It works according to its own program, its own agenda. But what you could do in order to enhance the frequency of its stimulation is to keep in mind your goal, to remember it more often. But this requires that the goal that you're pursuing is meaningful to you. Because otherwise you don't want to remember it. Why would you remember something that is not meaningful or that is not sufficiently urgent or important? These are qualities that are necessary in order for the memory of the object pursued after, the aim, the goal, to pop up in the mind stream more frequently. We naturally tend to remember things that are more important to us, that are more urgent or that are more meaningful, that give meaning to our life. And that's why people who pursue goals that are imposed upon them, they can still do it. But then you'd have to stay longer hours in the office waiting for that motivation to be aroused, because the goal itself is meaningless to you. It's something that you're forced to do, or you have to do. You don't love it. Your heart is not in it. So this makes the task very much more difficult, but not impossible. And also, even if it's not a goal that you're naturally interested in, you could make it something that is meaningful. You could turn anything, any experience, in the uh, whatever it is that you're pursuing outside of yourself to be meaningful. Like, for example, a job that you have to do just to get paid. You don't like it, but you have to get paid. You could say, oh, well, I have to do this in order to support my family, in order to pay for my child's tuition, etc. You turn something that is entirely meaningless into something that is meaningful, even though it is not meaningful to you, not directly, but you use it in order to do something else that is meaningful, supporting your children financially or something like this. That is meaningful to you. But if nothing is meaning, if you cannot connect it to something else that is meaningful to you, then the question at this point is whether you should be doing it at all, whether you should be pursuing that kind of goal at all. And then the arousal of motivation in the pursuit of something like this is really difficult. It's really more like an experience of pain. I also sent a chapter on depression because pain and depression is something that arises, which is the opposite of motivation, of course. It arises in situations precisely like this, in the pursuit of something that is not naturally motivating or stimulating, or that is meaningless, entirely meaningless, that you couldn't even conceptually render it into something that is meaningful. This gives rise to depression, gives rise to vipavatanha, the opposite of motivation or self-stimulation. So of course the nature of the goal itself is something that you have to think about a lot, I believe. Now, in terms of Dhamma, it's important to note that we are here talking about the pursuit of goals that are not really transcendental or spiritual. Because a transcendental or spiritual goal, a goal that correlates to Dhamma, is inward. You're pursuing something that leads to the transformation of your own self, of your own mind, that leads to panya, that leads to self-understanding, that leads to samadhi. These are things that are not even outside. It's not a musical instrument that you seek to master, or a PhD that you seek to write. Ultimately speaking, from a perspective of Dhamma, all these things are meaningless, and are completely meaningless. Even supporting a family and paying for the tuition of children and doing all these or honorable things like defending one's country or making significant scientific contribution or medical contribution that leads to the alleviation of suffering in the world. All these things that are about the external reality, the external world, are entirely meaningless, ultimately speaking. And so far as your psyche is concerned, as your chitta is concerned, these things are meaningless. They are not going to help you transcend death. They are not going to help you break free from the cycle of rebirth. They might actually do the opposite. They might entrench your psyche in its delusional connections with this world. So from a dharmic point of view, ultimately, motivation is a motivation towards a transcendental goal, not a mundane goal. And motivation in that context follows somewhat different rules, because you're pursuing here something that is had the highest degree of unnaturalness, and in relation to which the natural mind, the evolutionary mind, puts the highest resistance. And so that's why it's more difficult to pursue a transcendental or spiritual goal, especially in the way we understand this in Buddhism. It's the consciousness transcending itself, as it were. And so this is something that is quite different in the way by which motivation functions. But it's important to make this distinction that interest in Dhamma and motivation to pursue as a Dhamma practice is there are common things, but it's just a different way of motivation to write a PhD or whatever it is else that correlates to samsara. It's about the world. It's not about you. It's not about your psyche, and it's about its deliverance. So this is a vast difference, and it's also something to contemplate, something to think about. Because in as much as there are common features of motivation in whatever pursuit, transcendental or mundane, there are also conflict here. And even independently from the question of motivation, the biggest conflict is the amount of time that you have to spend pursuing one goal, mundane goal. That is demanding. I mean, writing a PhD, that's a very demanding pursuit. It takes a lot of time, especially if you're not naturally intensely motivated to pursue with it. It's going to consume a lot of time. Whereas also Dhamma practice needs a lot of time to make substantial progress. And further, the manner by which you exercise your intellect and your attention in the pursuit of a PhD is in many ways not just different, but could be contradictory or even conflictual with the manner by which the attention is exercised in the pursuit of progress in Dhamma and the pursuit of deliverance. There are certain conflicts there, and it's important to know exactly what is it in the mundane exercise of attention that conflicts with the transcendental exercise of it. And this is something also that I wrote about in my book. I could talk about it perhaps later in some detail.